The year was 1873. Father Bérenger Sonier had just been assigned to the remote parish of Rennes-le-Château, a forgotten village perched on a hilltop in the Languedoc region of southern France. The church he inherited, dedicated to Mary Magdalene, was crumbling. The tower, silent for generations, stood apart from the main sanctuary, its stones weathered by centuries of mistral winds and winter rains. Local tradition warned the tower was never to be disturbed. But necessity demanded repairs, and on an October morning, as golden light filtered through the narrow windows, Father Sonier lifted the first floorboard. Beneath the oak plank, in a space that had been sealed for perhaps 400 years, lay a leather-bound manuscript. Its pages were brittle, the ink faded to sepia, but the words were still legible. And what those words suggested would consume the rest of Sonier's life and raise questions that linger to this day. Why would a rural parish church hide genealogical records in such an elaborate manner? What family line required this level of protection? And why did Father Sonier, after reading those pages, suddenly begin renovating his church with funds no village priest should possess? While official church archives remain largely silent on what Father Sonier discovered, local researchers and genealogists have spent more than a century trying to reconstruct a story written on those hidden pages. What emerges is not merely a tale of buried treasure, but something far more provocative, a secret lineage protected across generations, hidden in the ancestry of French peasants who were perhaps not peasants at all. The manuscript, according to those who claim to have studied transcriptions before it vanished into private collections, was a genealogical register. But this was no ordinary record of births and deaths. The document traced the bloodline backward through the centuries, through the noble houses of Provence, through the Crusader kingdoms, and, if the annotations are to be believed, to Jerusalem itself, to a family that, for reasons both sacred and dangerous, had been forced into exile and obscurity. Notice the unusual detail. The manuscript did not use family names in the conventional sense. Instead, it employed a cipher, a code of symbols that corresponded to specific noble houses. Researchers who have attempted to decode these symbols identify references to the House of Anjou, the Counts of Toulouse, and, most intriguingly, a matrilineal line marked with the symbol of a rose and a chalice, a symbol that appears nowhere in standard heraldic registers, yet recurs in the artwork of churches across Languedoc. Why matrilineal line? In medieval Europe, royal and noble succession passed almost exclusively through fathers and sons. Daughters married into other houses. Their bloodlines were absorbed. Yet this manuscript insisted on tracing descent through mothers and daughters, as though the sanctity of the lineage resided not in titles or land, but in the blood of the women who carried it. The village of Rennes-le-Château sits in Cathar country. For those unfamiliar with this chapter of history, the Cathars were a Christian sect that flourished in southern France during the 12th and 13th centuries. They believed in the profound spiritual equality of women. They honored Mary Magdalene, not as a repentant sinner, but as an apostle, perhaps the first apostle. And they were systematically destroyed during the Albigensian Crusade, their libraries burned, their leaders executed, their followers driven underground. But according to local tradition, not everything was lost. When the fortress of Montségur fell in 1244, the final stronghold of the Cathars, legend speaks of 4 parfaits, or perfected ones, who escaped in the night, carrying with them the treasure of the Cathars. Mainstream historians interpret this treasure as spiritual texts or relics. But genealogists studying the Languedoc region have noticed something peculiar, a sudden appearance of new families near remote villages immediately following Montségur's fall. Families with no prior records, families whose descendants centuries later would protect certain knowledge with extraordinary fervor. Father Sonier's discovery must be understood in this context. The manuscript he found beneath floorboards was not simply old. It was protected. The tower itself was constructed in a manner that suggests deliberate concealment. During the restoration, workers discovered that the foundation contained stones bearing Visigothic carvings, far older than the medieval church above. Beneath those stones, archaeologists later found evidence of a Roman structure, and beneath that, traces of something older still, a site that may have been sacred long before Christianity arrived in Gaul. This layering is not accidental. In the language of symbolism and sacred architecture, it suggests continuity, a bloodline, like the tower itself, built upon ancient foundations, protected by each successive generation. Hidden in plain sight, the manuscript included names. While the original has never been made public, transcriptions exist in the private archives of certain French genealogical societies. According to researchers who have examined these transcriptions, the register lists a woman named Esclarund, a common name in medieval Languedoc, meaning light of the world. This particular Esclarund is recorded as having arrived in Rennes-le-Château around 1250, accompanied by 3 women, described as her guardians. She married a local nobleman, a minor lord whose own ancestry traced back to the Merovingian kings. Their children inherited land, modest titles, and, if the manuscript is accurate, a secret that would be passed down through 20 generations. What was this secret? The manuscript does not state it plainly. Instead, it offers clues written in the allegorical language of medieval mysticism, references to the vine and the branch, to the sanctuary prepared in exile, to the daughter of daughters, whose name is written in the book of life. Mainstream historians view such language as standard religious metaphor, typical of the era's devotional literature. Yet those who study esoteric genealogy propose a different interpretation. They argue that these phrases encode a specific claim that Esclarund was a direct descendant of a sacred bloodline, that she carried within her lineage a connection to the very origins of the Christian story, and that powerful forces within the medieval church knew of this lineage and sought to erase it. Consider the pattern of protection. The manuscript was not simply hidden, it was placed in a location that required someone with authority and knowledge to access it. The floorboards of the tower would only be lifted during major renovations, and such renovations required approval from church hierarchy. Yet Smon ensured that when the time came, the right person would find what was meant to be found. Father Sonier was not a random priest. He had studied history and ancient languages. He corresponded with scholars across Europe. He was, in a sense, chosen for this moment. After his discovery, Sonier's behavior changed dramatically. He began spending vast sums on the church's renovation, installing stained glass windows depicting unusual biblical scenes, commissioning statues with cryptic inscriptions, even constructing a private library tower that he called Tour Magdala, the Magdalene Tower. When ecclesiastical authorities demanded to know the source of his funds, Sonier refused to answer. He was subsequently suspended from his priestly duties. Yet he continued his work, supported by donations from wealthy patrons whose identities remain mysterious. What did these patrons want? According to correspondence preserved in regional archives, they were deeply interested in genealogy. Several were members of European nobility. Others were scholars associated with esoteric societies that studied the hidden history of Christianity. They believed that Sonier had found evidence of something that, if proven, would reshape the understanding of Western civilization's spiritual foundations. The trail does not end in Rennes-le-Château. Researchers have discovered similar patterns of concealment in other locations across southern France and northern Spain. Churches with hidden chambers, noble families with gaps in their genealogical records, precisely at moments of historical upheaval. Coded testaments that leave property to women in perpetuity, ensuring that the matrilineal line would never be broken. In the mountains of the Pyrenees, there exists a network of families who to this day claim descent from a lineage they call the protected ones. They do not advertise this claim. They do not seek recognition, but within their homes they preserve documents, marriage certificates, baptismal records, letters that trace their ancestry back to the 13th century and beyond. DNA studies conducted by independent genealogists have revealed an unusually concentrated genetic signature in this population, suggesting a founder effect, a small group that remained isolated and intermarried for centuries, preserving something specific in their bloodline. What were they preserving? The descendants speak carefully. They refer to a sacred trust, to the memory of she who came from the East, to a duty passed from mother to daughter, ensuring that the truth would never be completely lost, even if the world chose not to believe. Father Sonier died in Wenat. His housekeeper, Marie Denarnaud, lived until 1953. Before her death, she promised to reveal a secret that would make people rich. She died of a stroke before she could speak. The manuscript that Sonier found disappeared. Some believe it was acquired by the Vatican. Others claim it rests in a private collection in Switzerland. Still others whisper that it was returned to the tower, hidden once more, waiting for another moment of discovery. The Church of Mary Magdalene still stands in Rennes-le-Château. Pilgrims come from around the world, walking the same stones Father Sonier walked, standing in the same tower where he lifted that fateful floorboard. They search the walls for hidden messages. They study the symbolism in the stained glass. They wonder about the genealogy that someone asked for and took extraordinary lengths to protect. While official Catholic doctrine maintains that the Magdalene was a devoted follower who witnessed the resurrection, traditions preserved in Provence tell a different story, one of exile, of a pregnant woman fleeing persecution, of a sacred bloodline protected by fishermen and shepherds who became the nobility of France. Mainstream historians dismiss these traditions as medieval folklore. Yet the consistency of the legend across centuries, the pattern of protection encoded in architecture and art, and the genealogical anomalies documented in parish records suggest something more complex and simple myth. The manuscript beneath the floorboards was not the only evidence. In the sacristy of Sonier's church, investigators found a series of parchments hidden inside a hollow pillar. These documents, written in Latin and Old French, referenced the line of the Grail, a term that appears repeatedly in medieval literature, but whose meaning remains debated. Some scholars interpret the Grail as the cup from the Last Supper. Others, studying the linguistic roots of the Old French sang Grail, propose an alternate reading, sang Royal, royal blood. Not a vessel, but a lineage, not a cup, but a womb. If this interpretation holds weight, the entire Grail mythology, the quests of Arthur's knights, the guardians in hidden castles, the wounded king awaiting healing, becomes a coded genealogy, a map to a bloodline that had to be protected through allegory, because acknowledging it directly would mean death. The tower stands silent still. The floorboards have been replaced. Tourists walk above the space where the manuscript lay hidden for 4 centuries, unaware of what once rested beneath their feet. But in the archives of genealogical societies, in the DNA databases of ancestry researchers, in the private libraries of families who trace their roots to medieval Languedoc, the investigation continues. Whether one views Father Sonier's discovery as historical fact or enduring legend, the implications remain profound. Someone believed this lineage mattered enough to encode it in stone and parchment, to risk excommunication and exile, to build an entire tradition of secrecy spanning generations. Someone believed that this blood, this ancestry, carried something sacred that the world was not ready to acknowledge. And perhaps that is the true mystery of the Silent Tower, not what was found, but why it had to be hidden at all. In an age when kings and popes claimed divine authority, when bloodlines determined the fate of nations, what family could have existed whose very survival threatened the foundations of power? What truth could be so dangerous that it had to be whispered across centuries, mother to daughter, guardian to guardian, until the day when the world might finally be ready to remember? The dust has settled on the floorboards of Rennes-le-Château, but the questions Father Sonier awakened that October morning remain suspended in the golden light of history, waiting, like the tower itself, for those brave enough to look beneath the surface and ask what has been forgotten, or what we were never meant to know.